Transgender Youth, Why Transgender Children Decide Their Gender at Such a Young Age by Kaylee Velez. So what we're going to do is take an age group of 3 to 7-year-old transgender children and ask them a bunch of questions and decide if their answers are based off of intrinsic reasoning or external influences. And we're going to compare that to child development and try to decide why they want to be transgender. This is a stepping stone kind of research for future researchers because this is only going to give us so much information. And hopefully we'll be able to inform parents a little bit on how to handle their children one way or another, whether they believe in being transgender or not. It was hard to find literature on this age group, but that's why I wanted to do this study. So in one article, I did find that the patterns of transgender tendencies in children that can indicate that they will be transgender as an adult. In this article, it also said that children can choose their sexuality as early as 18 months old, but that kind of contradicts the stages of development where gender is not a solid concept until after the age of 7 or older. One term that was helpful was gender constancy, which is the idea that gender remains the same over time despite changes in physical appearance. And what that means is, like, when you think of a woman, you think of the way a woman looks, and that will always be the same whether you are one or not, and the same goes for a man. These are Piaget's stages of development, cognitive development. I tacked on 1 year to the pre-operational age because I thought about trying to do this interview and this study with my daughter, and she's 2, and that just wouldn't work. So that's why the age range is 3 to 7, not 2 to 6. But in pre-operational stages, they are thinking symbolically, but they are very egocentric, which doesn't mean they have a big ego. It just means that they don't know how to consider anyone but themselves. It's just not there yet. They don't know how to think logically yet. And they also have extreme imagination. And when you get to the concrete operational stage, logic is applied, there's conservation, and they know classification. Things are more solidified, and gender is a classification. So Kohlberg's stages of moral development are less defined by age ranges, but the one I need to pay attention to is the preschool one because it's about half of my age group. This is where their interests are based off of rewards and punishments. So they do things because of what the outcome will bring. And this is what leads me to believe that, their outcome, their reward or punishment for deciding to be transgender is what is going to benefit them in one way or another, and that's why they decide externally. Within the literature, I found 2 terms that would help me a lot, which is gender identity and gender dysphoria. Gender identity is how humans associate sexually and can be a baseline for social identity. So a transgender boy will probably not hang out with girls because he was born a girl. He'll probably hang out with boys. Gender dysphoria is a mental illness where individuals do not know what gender they are despite knowing their natal sex. And correlation is not causation. That's very important to note because even though there are people who are transgender that have GED, most of the time these people with gender dysphoria can't decide one way or another. Most people who are transgender want one way or another. And there's a lot of information on children who decide intrinsically and through external influence their gender, but most of them are adolescent studies. The purpose of this study is to gather information as to why children decide to be transgender before they have things like gender solidified. They don't have concrete operations or logic or classifications yet, so it's interesting to find out why they do this. It's a study to open the door for future research on transgender issues within this age group, and hopefully we'll be able to provide some information to parents whether they support the decision to be transgender or not. Education is always power. To get the sample size, we need to contact the Office of National Statistics. We can send them a copy of our invitation, and then they can send it to all the people who have reported having a transgender child within the age group. That gives us a representative stratified sample. It's representative because of the transgender children between the ages of 3 and 7, and it's stratified because later on we'll separate into intrinsically influenced and externally influenced, and then we can either send the informed consent or have it available online. Conduct an interview with each child, and the answers that they give are going to help us decide if they are internally influenced or externally influenced to make this decision. Video conferences are going to be available, and the children can draw pictures instead of verbally express themselves, because younger children probably can't verbally express themselves as well as the older children in the sample. And the questions can be altered if they need to be, depending on the age, but they still need to ask the same thing. And the interview will be no longer than 15 to 30 minutes, but it could be less based on the attention span. And one thing to note is that there will probably be children who just don't do the interview and they might be null and void. Once we have all the answers, we need to determine what is intrinsic versus external. And it can be difficult, but it can be done. So the definition of intrinsic reasoning is what can come naturally, what's internal motivation. There's no reward necessary. My example here is receiving less on Christmas in order to give to the less fortunate because it feels good. You don't need a reward to feel good about that. Whereas an external influence is anything that the environment takes part in altering thinking and behavior. It's reward-based. The outcome is a punishment or a reward. So hitting is punishable by timeout, but playing nicely is rewarded by extra playtime. And here's a list here of keywords that go with each one. And then after we get these answers, we need to calculate each one in a percentage for each age, and then as the whole study group as a whole. Here are a couple of examples of situations of transgender children, so go ahead and pause the PowerPoint and read through and decide for yourself if they are externally influenced or intrinsically influenced. Okay, so Kayla is intrinsically influenced and Thomas is externally influenced. I think these ones are pretty obvious. Here are a couple more, but these ones are going to be a little bit harder. So go ahead and pause and try to figure that out. Okay, these are both external reasons. Yes, it may seem like in Joshua's case that it's an internal reason because he wants to fulfill something within him, but it's an external motivation because the reward is playing with his parents. And I think the other one is pretty obvious. Based on what I know about children in their developmental stages, I'm predicting that there will be a higher percentage of children who are transgender because of external influences. In these graphs here, I also added gender dysphoria because there's a strong possibility that there may be a couple children who actually do suffer from gender dysphoria. So I just picked these numbers. I did 15 children per age and then did the math as needed. So this is what I think my information would look like. And the reason why I chose my predicted result as an externally influenced decision is because children are very influenced by their environments. They're very impressionable. They do anything and everything that the people around them do. And they are copycats pretty much until they can think logically in concrete operations. They don't have the concept of gender or identity very solidified yet. Although this is an externally influenced decision, their patterns can probably determine their gender in adulthood. Basically, children between 3 and 7 years old will decide to be transgender because of social influences within their environment. So the study in the end had to be altered a lot, but it turned into a pretty good stepping stone, and the reason for that was because of lack of information on the age group. But that's okay because now we can use this study to do different subgroups. Since the environment has a lot of variables in it, you could do one on socioeconomic status or race or religion, whatever, and it'll be information that we can use. The IRB told me that it was approved with corrections, and what they needed me to do was discuss GD, gender constancy, and gender identity in my predicted results. And to do that, I added the possibility of GD in my data because there's not solidification of gender constancy or gender identity yet in this age group. And the information that I can use, that I gather to give to parents, is going to help them find tools and ways to support their child in one way or the other. It doesn't matter if they believe in being transgender or not. The information will be useful to them. And if their child has gender dysphoria, I would give them a list of resources to help and figure out how to go from there. Okay, here are my references, and thank you for listening.